Welcome to the Wolf and Bull podcast. I am the Wolf, and my co-host is
the Bull. Is here today.
And we have a wonderful episode in store for you today. Just a quick reminder, if you happen to like any of the information that you see, any of the content that you see, you can find us at The Wolf and Bull on Instagram. Additionally, you can also find us on YouTube and Rumble. Go ahead and join the Wolf and Bull family, and we will have plenty of content for you to dissect as time goes on.
Even if you hate our content, join the conversation, man. We love comments of all kinds. The Wolf just loves to bark back at people, so to speak.
Bark back or howl back?
Howl back, yeah. Bark back. Well, depends.
And this very strange transition.
I can snort back.
Okay. Moo back.
Hey, watch it over there, Ray.
A very strange transition. This episode is brought to you by Americano Ammunition Coffee, serving true American patriots the means to defend their freedom, one caffeinated caliber at a time. Make sure to visit their website, ammoandcoffee.com. You can find all of their coffee beans there. I believe you can also find merch there, too, as well. And if you happen to be in the Arizona, Phoenix, Queen Creek area, you can go to their location, use the code WolfandBull, and you'll get 25% off of your order.
Somebody is wearing their merch right now.
I am. I'm wearing their merch. Yeah. We also believe probably have a hat over there as well behind our esteemed guest who is joining us once again. Sean,
by popular demand,
a.k.a. the Stingray, is in the studio once again. Right. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Of course. How's it been? How's life been?
Life's been good. It's been busy, but yeah.
You know, I didn't think stingrays had bioluminescence or that change of color thing like octopus and stuff, but I see a different kind of tone, different look. Color tone, different look out of the stingray today.
Trying something new.
All right. Love it.
Thanks for bringing that up, by the way.
I gotta watch it. You gotta be nice to stingrays though, because they can kill you. They can get you.
They can sting you.
Yeah, get some barbs to them. That's right.
Well, I think today's going to be a pretty interesting episode. Now, just a brief disclaimer before we jump into anything, because I think disclaimer. I think everyone listening should be aware. Now, this episode is specifically about the recent documentary from Hulu. I believe it was directed by FX. It's called The Secrets of Hillsong, specifically Hillsong United. So this episode is going to be about Hillsong United specifically, but we do encourage our listeners and our viewers to do their own research, come to your own conclusions on this, because we have all watched the documentary. And this is going to sound weird after I say that. So you don't have to, because it was really depressing. But at the same time, we do encourage you to do some of your own research.
But it was illuminating as well. I think it was worth the watch. Yeah. I think you got to take from it some things and leave some other things behind, as most documentaries allow for. But
yeah, Vanity Fair tends to throw some things into their. I believe it was Vanity Fair.
Vanity Unfair.
Yeah, yes. Tends to throw some things in their documentaries. Now, I think before we jump into the real meat and potatoes of the Hillsong documentary, I think we should probably give our listeners and viewers just a little brief context on our experience.
I thought you were going to get into the wine and wafers.
That would work.
Kind of the right tone, right?
That was very religious of you. That was very religious of you. It was beautiful.
Communion. Can you imagine communion with meat and potatoes? That would be a whole kind of different thing.
I don't think anyone would ever leave.
It's a potluck.
It's like a potluck.
But I think it'd be really good to give our listeners and viewers some context, maybe from each of us, on our experience with some of the, with specifically the theology. We're talking about Christianity today, and maybe our background, to give some context on all this. So who wants to go first?
Ooh, man. My background's the oldest. And growing up a Southern Baptist, and I should just leave it right there. Southern Baptist. You can use your imagination.
This snake is going to speak the word of God.
Not quite that bad. I grew up in Michigan, so Southern Baptist in Michigan was not quite Southern Baptist elsewhere. But there was a lot of fire and brimstone, for sure. We walked in a lot, and a lot of it was, I mean, like most churches today, they were always saying, okay, empty your pockets first, because that was like the prime, and we'll get into that later, because that is the prime motivator around a lot of the stuff that degrades into the things we'll talk about with Hillsong, I think. But I loved going to church on Sunday. Had a Sunday school. Actually taught something that they were intentionally trying to teach. We've talked about that before in previous podcasts. But having said that, there was a accepted and non-accepted way of doing things, and which I think our society today would be better off if we had some more structure around. We've talked about that in a lot of different ways over many podcasts. And I think the lack of structure, the come one, come all, the large swinging open door of the churches today, especially the megachurches, creates a funnel that's almost too wide. Mm-hmm. And it creates situations because we're all freaking failed human beings. Mm-hmm. That's what it comes down to. We're failed human beings. I'm going way off on a tangent.
You really are.
My history.
Yeah, my history.
My history.
We're all failed human beings.
Was the guy was up there thumping the Bible, telling us we're all going to hell unless this and this and this happen over and over and over. And I was sitting in the pew, actually I was looking at the strawberry blonde 2 pews over from me is what I was probably doing. But that's my history. But I can tell you just a little brief. During my 20s, early 30s, I was in a kind of a smaller church in San Diego. And we had talked about this before. There's a pretty infamous guy had turned into the pastor there. And he had been in and out of prison as a con man. Barry, I forget his last name.
Manilow.
Yeah. Yes. It was good. We had great singing time in that church. It's very good. But Lola was always there.
Oh, God. Right? So he abused kind of the system as well. Basically.
Oh, well, and there was some serious abuse within that small church itself. Mm-hmm. But there was something that reminded me of that episode of that few years of my life when Barry Minkow.
Yeah.
And that episode, in very personable, very charismatic person. Mm-hmm. Therein lies, I think, the biggest problem with small and large churches and leadership in general, that it relies so much on charisma that there's an absence of tenable,
substance.
Behind the eyes kind of thing.
Okay, so
and that's where I'll leave my.
That's a mixed bag of. That's about a 6.5 out of 10 mixed bag review. Stingray, what is brief paraphrase? Your background, kind of where you're coming from on this.
Okay, background would be my parents went to a Calvary chapel in San Diego. It was actually called Horizon Christian Fellowship. So just as a little young man growing up in that church there, obviously my testimony for another day, but I went wayward for a long time, as you guys know, into drugs and other things. But so when I actually surrendered my life to Jesus, I ended up going back to Horizon Christian Fellowship, which is basically the background of a Calvary chapel. Mike McIntosh, he was discipled by Chuck Smith, who was a very, very popular pastor. And so that's all I knew at the time. Went to a discipleship school, eventually took some Bible college courses at a Bible college, and just started getting involved in ministry. And when you're new in the ministry, you just have this zeal and you're just excited and you just want to serve and you just want to give everything over, right, to the ministry, without really thinking about kind of the underbelly sometimes that's happening behind the scenes. You just kind of go in, and I think that's fine. It's kind of like a childlike faith. Then as I started to work for various churches, some very small, some very large, you really start to see that ministry behind the veil and what goes on. And I don't think there's no perfect church, because like you mentioned, Bull, that we're depraved. We're desperately needing something to heal ourselves from our humanity, which is sick, right? So, but I think there's ways to really, help the church. I think we need more accountability. I think we need more structure. But when I was in it, I just realized, man, these are. Much of them were being ran like corporations, and a lot of money involved, a lot of mismanagement, and lots of infidelity, which we saw through the Hillsong documentary. So I saw all of that, and again, background, I lived all of that personally for churches that I worked for. One in particular was a mega church in San Diego, where there was just a lot of things that happened. I eventually ended up resigning because of those reasons. And so that's just some of my background. A lot of church context, working for a lot of churches. I worked for one right here in Arizona, locally, and it turned into a mega church while I was there for the 3 years that I was there. And so when I started seeing that trend, I knew it was my time to leave. I just saw the idea of just big front door, big funnel of people coming in, but not much discipleship happening, not much growth. So yeah, that's kind of more my intro background.
Yeah. Mine's a lot shorter than all of your guys's. I happen to grow up in the church, and by the church, I mean a various conglomeration of different theological sects. Mostly evangelical, but there were some other churches, I believe I mentioned before, like Lutheran at one point in time, and non-denominational. There was, what's another term that's popularized today? Not hysteric. That's not the right word.
Histrionics, for sure.
Like non-denominational. I would just say non-denominational, evangelical. And for a period of time, I was also within the worship team of a church for about 4 years. Saw the background of the church then. It was a smaller church. There was a lot of kind of similar stuff that you were talking about, maybe condensed in a small form, not a whole ton of structure. And we've mentioned this in other episodes. There wasn't a lot of accountability on behalf of the church. Not to say that those individuals in the church were doing anything wrong, merely just pointing out that it didn't seem to be tied much to anything. And my biggest thing, part of the reason why I'm not I would say probably not as much of a practicing Christian anymore, specifically because of that type of stuff, because I see that being an American church trend. Now, it doesn't mean the churches are bad, doesn't mean that the culture associated with the church is bad. It just means that there just seems to be a hyper focus on maybe that Hillsong structure.
You know, I would say the overall culture may be the wrong word, but you know, it's like a lot of things. You got to be able to take from something what you're looking to fill. I think you said something a moment ago about, you know, getting into those churches and looking, you know, where human beings are looking for something to fill the hole, right? And I think anybody that would be honest with themselves about their belief system is that it's designed to fill something that is missing in the human event, not experience. Nature, but an experience. There you go, human experience. And I think that is not only desirable, but it's needed from an individual's basis. So at least that's the way I feel. So I don't necessarily even think that a Hillsong or a megachurch or a small church or whatever you think you fit into best is the wrong thing for individuals to do, as long as you're being under emotional about it. I know that's a hard thing to say about filling a hole in your life with belief, but there's this, look at these giant churches. What they do to draw people in, even for those that are telling stories and sound very logical and they're pulling on emotional strings. Now that's something, I mean, anybody that's ever watched them, ever watch a movie and there's no music, and then you watch the same movie, and there's really good selected music in it, and the experience of that movie is so different.
Well, it's intentional.
Well, yeah, it's absolutely intentional, and that's my point with these churches, these mega churches in particular. They know that they're trying to create an environment to draw people in. Now, sometimes it's for the right reasons, sometimes it's the wrong reasons. The problem is, I think it tends to start right in the correct way, and then it flows away from that because money kind of helps corrupt those situations. My point in all that is if you're cognizant of your own frailties, your own disposition while watching these emotional things, if you're able to step back from that and say, what did I hear today that resonates with me? To more solidly define who I am from a religious or a belief standpoint, or what can I take from it that helps me in my life today? That's a good thing. But if you eat the whole elephant, you're in trouble. And you can see that over and over.
Well, I'd love to get your, Sean, all of us really, I'd love to get all of our opinions on this documentary, because this documentary it's created, I believe, by Vanity Fair FX. It's both of them in tandem. Obviously, secular organizations are going to have a hypercritical focus on some of these things. And I think in a lot of instances, documentaries like this, there's a net positive in some instances, because we're talking about something that unfortunately Hillsong Church or Hillsong United or whatever you want to call it, because there's like multiple names, they didn't want to talk about for a long time. So they're exposing a truth and a measure there. With that being said, these documentaries tend to have a bias. So I'd love to get your guys' opinions on the documentary itself and some maybe key points on how you felt while watching it or what you thought while watching it.
Yeah, I guess I'll chime in on that. I think, well, first of all, it's really challenging not to have a bias, especially from my background. I would admit that while watching it, I was angry at times. And again, it's coming from a place of being jaded, from my own experiences. I do believe that the people who put together the documentary did a pretty decent job. Keep in mind, you have real life people, talking about their personal experiences, and those things I don't think that you can fake. From that perspective of we're putting it. I mean, historically, they grabbed the right type of people who are a part of that organization to highlight some of the issues that they were facing. So it's, we want to be careful not to, stroke too big of a broad brush when it comes to the context of church at large. But at the end of the day, it's really hard not to, because we just have seen the demise of the Western church for the last, for a very long time, maybe, but just looking at it from a trend over the last 20, maybe even 30 years, there's just been so much mismanagement of resources and people's tithes and offerings. And honestly, just infidelity is just rampant in the church. And most of the time it is just kind of swept under the rug, and it's handled behind closed doors. So from my perspective, watching the documentary, sure, I had a lot of emotion attached while watching it because of my personal experiences. But at the end of the day, I thought they did a really good job. Now, I also did my own research back in 2009, 10, and then again later on towards 2016 about Hillsong. And when I ended up leaving the megachurch that I was a part of in San Diego, I ended up planting my own church and made the decision that we would not use Hillsong music and or Bethel music in our church congregation for those reasons and for the research that I had done on my own. And I think that more churches need to start doing stuff like that and taking a stand on those things, not using their worship, even though it sounds fantastic. But at the end of the day, what's really happening within the theology and the makeup of that church organization? Because we can't just accept their music just because it sounds good at face value. We have to do a little bit more digging, a little bit more investigating.
You belong to a number of churches, and I have a question I often wonder, because whether we like to or not, we tend to create entities, whether it's a church or a private business or a public business, around a particular structure, mission statement, core competencies, kind of a framework of understanding of what you're trying to sell or develop or whatever the case may be. And then you have to add people to that to manage those things, to distribute those things, to sell those things. And because the megachurch we're talking about today, or any of these other ones, or any business, it's not like the business is evil. It's not like the church is the problem. Maybe it's we end up not keeping the main thing, right? And people are they're the good and the bad in that. And it's so being in those big churches like that, what were their HR staffs really like? Because it tends to make me think that if you were an outside company that had an HR staff that was like it was siloed and said, these are the things you do. It doesn't matter what the managers say one way or another. These are the bullet points. And if people go over this line, this is the certain. I think the churches don't do that. I've never been around that, but what was your experience with the HR side of those things?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, my experiences from an HR standpoint is, HR, they do handle certain situations from a staff standpoint quickly and swiftly, and disciplinary actions and things like that accordingly. But regardless of all that, the HR departments that I've experienced, they are 100% submissive or to the senior leadership. And so it's whatever the lead or senior pastor, whatever shots he's calling, they have to kind of obey that certain scenario.
Yeah, this Frank guy, the first guy that started.
Yeah. Well, before we jump into like deep detail, let me give a context on the church because we haven't. Yeah,
you know me.
We haven't. Yeah, I know. We're so before we jump into that,
Frank is here.
For those of you who don't know anything about Hillsong Church, because I'm sure there's a ton of people out there that are not Christian or are Christian, just were not part of that denomination or just were unaware. Hillsong Church has been around for a pretty long time. They originated in Sydney, Australia in 1983. They were run by Bobby and Brian Houston. And they initially started as Hills Christian Life Center. They met in a hall of a congregation of about 45 people initially, and Brian Houston, who is on trial right now, and we'll get to that, he was the son of the Pentecostal pastor of the original church, Frank Houston.
In New Zealand.
Well, he started in New Zealand and then moved to Australia.
So basically, the church's primary focus, Hillsong specifically, was on contemporary worship music as they grew. It played a huge, phenomenal role in their growth. I mean, this became a massive, massive church over the years. They experienced presence in multiple locations across the globe, including major cities such as New York, London, and Paris. And they also have faced over the years multiple controversies and various challenges throughout their history. So unfortunately, and this is kind of where I find my struggle here, is there seems to be a common theme amongst organizational churches that reach a certain peak. And what I mean by that is not that every single one of them is corrupt or every single one of them has a problem, but there seems to be a common trend that it hits a threshold of growth and then all of a sudden this stuff starts coming out. And I'm not sure why. Reason, because we could talk about like the imperfections of humans, which we're going to talk about. We already have touched on. But you don't really see that in massive corporations all the time. And these are churches, well, not all the time. But here's the thing, is these are churches that operate as corporations. So the problem here is they're operating as a corporation, but they don't have the oversight of a corporation. So why is there always this disconnect?
This HR point that the Stingray is making, I think is real important because there's a submissive nature to people. I mean, they talked about it in this documentary, how certain board members were all handpicked by the ultimate leader of that group, who ends up being, let's call it what it is. It's a cult. Okay. My point of view is cults. If you look at the definition, and I have not, by the way, I'm making this up as I go, but the definition of a cult probably centers from a personality. It starts with a personality, a charismatic personality that has a set of ideals and knows how to, frankly, emotionally tie people into that small circle. Yeah. Now that person is no longer the figurehead of a church. He or she is the church. Therein lies, I think, the problem, because if you go back to New Zealand, if you go back to Frank, the original founder of this church, he was a salesman of some kind. I can't remember what he was selling before, but he saw how other small churches around him would adhere to the messages, and it was his 15 minutes of fame, right? It turned into 50 years of fame. And he started hand-picking who was going to be involved around him. He became the church. And if I don't know where it happens, but there's some kind of threshold where individuals can have great ideas and they can have the greatest personalities in the world. But there, at some point or another, I think there's I got to say this right. I'm going to sound really bad, but it is under Patreon, right? So I'll just say what I'm going to say.
Say what you want to say, and I will cut it out.
Or not.
Or we'll cut it out.
I think these ultra charismatic people have these internal human personality flaws, if you will, that override the realities of where these things should go. It becomes more about them, and the only thing that feeds that is more and more about them. And if they're in control, they become the puppet master. That's what you can watch any of these things that happen. Well, you can watch it from a political standpoint because it's the same thing we're talking about.
Well, it's the same thing we're talking about, but there should be degrees of separation, in my opinion, specifically because of the nature of what this thing represents.
There should be. You're right.
And so, on the note of Hillsong, there are plenty of financial and leadership and cultural and practices and doctrinal problems that occurred over their 30, 40, 50 year span. And the reality that I see with a lot of this, and Stingray, maybe you can attest to this, is I get your cult of personality analogy, and I agree with that. But you'd think that the substance within the origin point of what the church should be focused around would maybe limit that a little bit, you'd think. So based on your experience and perspective, do you see there's some, did you witness or do you see from your perspective like a transition amongst leadership within churches that you've been to where they've originated and we want to help the community, we want to spread the gospel to, well, now that's going to take a back seat.
Yeah.
And my personality or getting people in the door or numbers become the primary focus.
Yeah, I would admit that I think a lot of people have good intentions. And then there are those who don't. I mean, if you look at, Frank Houston, I think his intentions right out of the gate were he was opportunistic. I mean, we can say it here. He was a pedophile, right? I mean, that's very clear that he was. I mean, even from the boys' home that he got started at and then moved on to the church context, and he was a predator. And that was evident. So I think his intentions right from the very beginning was, he had a big personality. He was charismatic. He knew he could draw in a crowd, and he used that to his advantage. And then he took advantage of people over and over and over again. But there are those who do start with really great intentions, I think. And but again, we have a lot of people with those good intentions as they're getting started, but they already have the personality flaws, as you were mentioning, Bull. And so as they're growing their congregation, what I've seen happen is their ego grows and grows and grows, and they start building the church around that personality of their flawed personality instead of the person, meaning Jesus. And they get so distracted. And as we mentioned before, they start surrounding themselves very intentionally with people who are just going to be a yes man, right, or yes woman. They're just going to go along for the ride with whatever they decide to do. So yeah, it's both and not one or the other. At the end of the day, there's some that have good intentions, and there are some that I think get right into it right from the very beginning, and they're going to preach the prosperity gospel. Yeah. They want the money, they want to be seen, they want to be up in front, and then they become powerful, and then they lord that power over their congregation, and then you feel obligated to that person to do whatever they desire. For example, I was meeting with a friend of mine here recently for lunch, and we're talking. He's got lots of money, and he says, "Hey, I was invited over to Pastor so and so's house for dinner." And I said, "Oh, really? Have you ever been invited over there for dinner before?" And he goes, "No." And I go, "He's going to ask you for money." And he goes, "Well, why would you do that?" I go, "Well, you have a lot of money, and they know that because you're giving frequently, probably, or do you give?" He goes, "Yeah." So they know how much you give, and so it's by design to invite people who have millions of dollars over to the lead pastor's house for dinner, and then they're going to ask you for money for some type of building project that they want to work on. And so we met a few weeks later, and we sat down again for lunch, and he says, "So I went over to the pastor's house for dinner." And I go, "Yeah." I go, "What happened?" He goes, "He asked me for money." I said, "See, I told you so." Again, I don't know the intentions a lot of times when people, pastors end up doing that, but I just see the mode of operation in the megachurch church, and that's how they do it. Just as an example.
Well, there's a formula, right? Mm-hmm. And
they know
they works. Talked about that in this documentary as well. How there's a lot of churches out there that have looked at Hillsong, and they're going to take that formula and hopefully shed the bad and look at the good and try to create something. But let me ask both of you this question, and not yourselves personally, but this is how you would, I know, I'm going to ask you a question, but not you personally. What I mean is don't answer the question in terms of what you believe of yourself, but what you would believe of the rest of the congregation or the majority of the congregation. Why do they go to church in the first place? Club. I've got my idea, but why do you think they go?
Friends and club community.
I think that's definitely,
for a lot of them,
I think that's definitely a part of that. I also think that they absolutely 100% want to please the lead pastor because they are a celebrity figure to them.
But what is the baseline of both of those answers, though? The psychological baseline.
Well, the psychological.
The real low end.
The low end is friendship. The low end is familiarity. The low end is
feeling better.
But again, and I think the caveat, because your question's a good question. The caveat, though, and this is something that has always bothered me, and Stingray, I think everyone here is probably bothered, is I look at something like the Hillsong controversy, and we'll get into it a little bit deeper, but I look into something like that, and it makes me question not only the leadership, but the congregants. Because this goes back to your knowledge of what the Bible says and what the Scripture says. We should be able, in any instance, whether theologically or otherwise, to notice someone who's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Like, minus my moniker. I mean, here's the thing is it's like stranger danger, right? If someone shows up at your house and you don't know them, and they knock on your door and they say, "Hey, yeah, you ordered a plumber," and you're like, "No, I didn't order a plumber." And they're like, "Well, let me fix your pipes." They're not there to fix your pipes, and that's a terrible analogy, but you know, you get what I'm saying.
I understand that, but is that the wolf preying on naivete?
Yeah,
or that's fine. Is that the person's fault or the wolf's fault?
Well,
is that grandma's fault for laying in bed?
Well, but
or is it the wolf's fault?
We could use the Kardashians as a recent example. She posted $1 million photos of her jewelry a few years ago and got robbed.
And she got it stolen.
So the question, I don't think it's a question merit of victim or perpetrator. I think the question is you should be aware as an adult.
My point, though, is whether you're aware or not, you're being told by maybe sources that are incorrect that there is a safe space you can go to that will make you feel better.
But you need to vet
because the rest of the world is making you feel bad all the time.
Well, what's your
your
take?
Life,
what's your
all
take
the problems?
On this?
Well, I think that it's multifaceted. You have the church who's really good at damage control, right? When things happen. So as a congregant, you're sitting there and they're basically telling you half truths a lot of the time, right? When something happens. And so they do a good job there. And so for the congregant who's there and they started and they were super excited about this new church or this movement. And they're there and it's part of community based. It's friendship based. It's you build those strong bonds. And so when something falls apart and the church is doing their damage control, you end up kind of overlooking stuff. I mean, I was on staff for a church in San Diego for 9 years. And I can recall after I was there probably within the first 6 months, and something happened, and I thought to myself, "Whoa, that's not cool. That's not godly leadership at all." But I overlooked it, right? You kind of go, "Okay, well, they're flawed. Everyone's flawed, and I'm not perfect. They're not perfect," and you overlook stuff, and then it was just, then this happens, and then that happens, and so you find yourself wanting again to obviously please God. So you're constantly questioning yourself of, well, do I just leave? Do I go because that happened? Or do I ride this out? Can I be a person of change here and a light here, a voice of reason here? So you start playing all these mind tricks with you, the whole time. In fact, there's still people that I've had very candid conversations with that are still on staff at that particular church in San Diego who have told me how dysfunctional it is, but they're still there, And so again, the people butts in the seats or people on staff, it does beg the question, why are you there? And, what's the reason behind it? Is there some kind of interesting, like, I've always thought of something like, the power of suggestion, right? You're together with a large group of people. For example, if you're watching a football game at home, right? And a great play happens. You're probably not jumping out of your seat every single time and cheering and, this is amazing. But when you go to a stadium and you're with a group of a bunch of people and the same type of play happens and one person gets out of their seats and then 1,000 and 10,000s, you're up out of your seat as well.
Yeah.
Same thing with the church. There's this community-based all together, and we're a team. We're doing this together. You're on mission, right? That's a big thing. Every church has a mission statement. So let's be on mission together. And so you overlook stuff all the time. I was so frustrated last night watching that because I have left churches for those reasons. Should I have left earlier? Yeah, I probably should have. But I was upset with the congregants a lot of the time because you're looking at this going, why are you still there? And I think to myself, why does Hillsong Church even still exist even now, even though they've lost tens of thousands of members? But it still exists because they still have parishioners.
Yeah.
They still have people paying, right, tithing there. And so it's still allowing the church to function.
Well, I guess this goes back to kind of what we said a little bit earlier is like the message is not necessarily the problem here, right? So if you, for example, and it can be seen in politics, it can be seen in hell, even with recent stuff with BLM. The abuse of a system has been seen throughout humanity. I guess the question that I have, and this is something I was asking the entire time I was watching this 4-part series, The Secrets of Hillsong on Hulu. We're not sponsored by them. Check it out now. But the whole time I was watching it, as I was saying, well, why did anyone within the church just realize that doing the difficult thing would save them? Like, you do the difficult thing as early as possible. It saves you from the problem later on. Prime example, Brian Houston with his father, right? His dad's a pedophile. Granted, hopefully Brian Houston did not engage in any of that. With that being said, he's now on trial in Australia for covering this up for years and decades. And the question I have is like, look, you could have said, my father was X. He should go to jail. Problem solved. Your conscience is clean. The church's conscience is clean. The thing is nipped in the bud.
But they're so afraid of losing congregants.
They gain congregants that way.
Well, you would think
That's
so.
what I would think.
You would think
right?
so. You would think so. But there are a lot of people that will sit in there in those churches, and they will leave if they hear something like that.
Well, I guess the reason I say, because this goes back to a lot of other things like politics and current American situations, because America seems to be in a very strange place right now. Doing the difficult thing might lose you people early on, but your message is not tainted. The concern I had watching that documentary, and this is it, there's so many memes, so many jokes in pop culture about this stuff. But you look at the Catholic Church, for example, rife with pedophilia. Had they have omitted not their message, but those people from their congregation and said, look, Jesus loves you, but you do not have a place here until you change, they would have gained fans. They would have brought people to the message of the gospel, because then people would say, well, you guys stand for something. And when you stand for something, you can't fall for everything. But if you don't stand for anything, you'll fall for anything.
So I think the difference is these personalities, these people that are looking to do evil are looking for a place to hide in plain sight. And they find these structures like the church, like the scouts, like politics, to do just that. And at the same time, church is a great example. Church is, from a biblical standpoint, anybody deserves redemption. Anybody.
Yeah.
There's a difference between hiding and exposing. Therein lies I think your point. If you do the hard things and expose these things, then people can't hide there anymore.
Well, they can't hide there anymore, and on top of that, they'll find redemption faster.
You are. I am agreeing with you. You're correct that the hard thing is there to do, but I think part of this is it's siloed off. They talked in this series, I think the fourth part of it, about how a lot of this came
to be, and we'll dive into that.
Well, and you can talk about it, but it was specifically around the little university they have, and how individuals thought they were the only ones being singled out or focused on negatively in this way, and it's very, very small problem, until they started looking at their own social media and putting together Facebook groups and things like that. that they discovered they weren't alone in this. And that's how it kind of grew and grew and grew. And I think that's part of the problem. It is that hiding in plain sight thing.
Well, even to your point too, you mentioned about the hiding and the exposing. Even when watching the documentary, do you remember the Zoom call that was being recorded? Even the pastor there
who
that was
leaked
doing
that, by the way. Did Bobby Houston leak that?
Who knows?
That's the question I have. Who leaked that?
Well, even the pastor that was doing damage control there, this, right? He actually said when Brian Houston, when all of the extramarital things were going on with him, he says, we're not going to hide this, but we're not going to expose it either. He actually said the same thing. That's the strategy, right? Because it's interesting how they do it.
If you just don't say anything.
Yeah, exactly. Right? I mean, I thought to myself, man, I saw that so many times. Did you see on that
Zoom? Bobby Houston was on that Zoom.
Yeah, she was.
With a little hat on and everything kind of in the corner. She was up in the only one that actually said her name on the thing.
Oh, I didn't catch that.
So my question is, you leaked it. Like, the only person that can technically leak it is the person that manages the entire meeting.
True.
Anyway, I could be wrong about that.
He actually said, "I hope nobody's recording this."
Well, I guess the big thing I have with this is like, look, I get what I'm requesting is difficult, but at the same time, like, the thing that hurts me is not that there was infidelity, not that there were abuses of financial, not that there was all that stuff, because that happens in a lot of different places, and I'm not saying it's okay. The thing that hurts me is there's going to be people like myself or people that have been in situations like we have that are like, oh yeah, no, I'm no longer a Christian.
And that was said in this thing
multiple times. And here's the problem here is this is a correlation or causation problem. Correlation is not causation, and they're not interchangeable. So if someone abuses you, like a parental figure or a teacher or a pastor, all parental figures and all teachers and pastors are not responsible for that abuse. That one person is. And so that's why I look at this scenario and I'm like, guys, Hillsong, you guys had you were the biggest, one of, if not the biggest church in the last 30 years. And instead of saying, you know what, we've got gangrene, we just got to cut the limb off and hope we don't bleed out. They just said, we're just going to let the entire body get infected. And then the entire representation, the image, and the message of the gospel is gone. Like, what do you do at that point?
And if a group thinks about that logically, about where they're going in the future, they would know that that's going to happen. Because you can't keep this. Nothing stays buried forever. Nothing.
Yeah. And it's not about it being buried, because you're right. You're 100% right on that.
Jimmy Hoffa.
It's about, he's down by the Titanic.
Wow.
Really? Sorry, I made the joke. Wow. There's been so many memes, and God forgive me. It's uncomfortable and sad. With that being said, like, I just look at this scenario like, no one has ever said once that the church needs to be realistically the perfect representation of Jesus, because that's just not accurate. It's not possible for humans to represent that. We can get close, but we can't become perfect. With that being said, like, I look at that whole scenario as just an entire failure and a contributor to the decline of what I would consider American community, because the church is a huge part of American history. It's not the reason why America was founded, but the ideas, the Enlightenment, and some of the things we talked about in other episodes push that type of freedom of religion. So it's like, people look at something like this documentary and they say, well, the entire thing's corrupted. It all makes no sense. Flying spaghetti monster in the sky. Well, what is the alternative? Science? Is the alternative science? We're all going to become scientists with our little lab coats? Or like, what's going to fill the community void?
Let's look. So nobody here knows the answer.
Yeah, right? No one knows the answer.
But what is, and you might be able to correct me on this, but I think it's when 3 or more are gathered in his name. Is it 2? I think it's 3, something like that.
2 or more, 3 or more.
That is the focal point of having whatever you call this thing. You're spelling it out as church, right? This is my point of view. It's not something I've researched and defined what should be or not should be a church. Church is a community. It can start as a very small one, but it's in my mind, it's about making each other better, not worse.
Yeah.
And then using a defined set of rules given to us by the Bible to help make us better. Isn't that the core of the whole damn thing?
I would say.
I mean, maybe I know I'm making it maybe too simple and all that kind of stuff. And then we, as human beings, like everything else, decide one of us is more right than the other. Well, and as soon as that happens, As soon as that happens, we stray.
Well, I think the big problem...
And we try to bring other people with us.
Well, I think the big problem, because I've heard that before, and I agree, there's community within 3 or more, when everyone's reading the Bible or praising the Lord or saying what you need to say in relation to the gospel. But I think the problem here is now there's becoming this disassociation between the importance of the body of Christ, which is the church, and just believing something. Because we look at the Bible, there's a reason why a pastor should be educated to the point that you've brought up in other episodes. There's a reason why there should be an understanding of historical context. There's a reason why there should be an understanding of what the book says, and then the interpretation that you might have of the book. The problem, and this is what I see when it comes to people who go to church as a club. They go to church as a club and they expect the pastor, what they say in association in the Bible, to become their view of what the Bible says. Or
that's because you're assuming they're more of an expert than you are.
As they should
right?
be.
As they should be.
With that being said, or they go home because of something that they're jaded about from the church and they never go back, and then they just read the Bible and take everything it says literally. There's no in between.
I understand.
So there has to be, you can't be because people always talk about like experts and then couch experts. You have to be something of both.
We all have opinions. That doesn't mean we're an expert by stating our opinion. We should have people that spend many more hours defining not who they are, but who they want to be through the context of what they're learning. That's where we define expertise. And an expert to me is literally someone that knows more than I do about whatever the subject is. There's a ladder of expertise. That's why there's a chain of command. There's a chain of understanding. There's a chain of for any organization, including churches.
There should be.
So what ends up happening again is the majority. This is my opinion. The majority of people go to church to feel better about their lives, about themselves, about people around them, the sense of community, all the different things we talked about. And then when something in that hierarchy of people that they call the experts is doing things behind a veil, it brings down that entire experience.
Well, it's because I think they're going for the wrong reason.
I'm not saying their reason's right or wrong. We all, look, every day, all of us get bombarded with a huge amount of negative. You can't watch a show, listen to something. You can't drive down the street and see billboards. You can't go into a restaurant without being bombarded with colors that make you more hungry, or smells that want you to eat some more fat, or cereal that you want to buy from the store. Millions of things are happening to us daily that are negative, and people just want to feel better. And there's... I hearken back to this a moment ago that I talked about. There is a hole in most people that needs to be filled. And they have a choice in what to fill it with. And we can talk about all kinds of things. A lot of negative things that get filled with that. And then you reach out and you say, here's a positive thing. Here's a community. Here's something that makes me feel better. Here's something that connects me to something beyond myself, something more important than myself. I can put and fill that hole with that. And then somebody at the top of that ruins it for you, destroys it.
But I think what, to Wolf kind of interjected there just a little bit ago. I think people do go for the wrong reasons though. Because I can go to the gym and feel better about myself. I can go to an exercise class, or I can go talk to a counselor. I can go do a lot of things in my life to go feel better. I can join a basketball league and play on a league and be a part of a team and find that community to feel better. In fact, I feel better when I get in my Corvette. That's why Stingray over here. And I go early in the morning, 6 a.m., and I go meet up with other guys with cars that I think are cool, and I feel better about myself. I'll be honest. I do. I mean, I know that might sound a little weird, but I enjoy it. Yeah. I really enjoy being around people who love cars. So, but when it comes to the church, the focus should always be, in my opinion, looking to or toward the one who is better in every way. Because I know I can't, and I will never be, or feel the best about myself. So I'm constantly looking to that person, meaning Jesus, because he is the better sacrifice, right? He was the better atonement. He was the better high priest. He was the better everything. That's what the Hebrew author talks about. The entire theme of Hebrews is Jesus is better in every way. So trust in him. And what I'm trying to get to there is that in church, Jesus was very clear with his disciples. He raised them up. He trained them for 3 years, mind you, and he spent every waking moment with them for 3 years. And then he sent them out and said, now go and make disciples of all nations. Mm-hmm. And so that is how Jesus started the church, and he started it with 12, right? And one failed miserably, Judas, who, basically betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. So even in that, if you look at a church context, looking to leadership from the church Jesus started, if somebody was following, Judas as one of the disciples and then he failed, the people who were following Judas should still keep their relationship with Jesus. Like a lot of people, I know that's kind of another tangent, but a lot of people who were at Hillsong who, when the leadership failed them, then they decided they weren't Christian anymore. And I disagree with that. Meaning that just because the leadership failed you doesn't mean that Jesus has failed you. Well, it should be more personal. But we're not teaching enough discipleship in the churches. And I will say that a lot. You guys hear me say discipleship probably a lot on your podcast. Because it's a matter of education and discipleship and digging deep into the Word of God so we can be aware of the wolves that are in sheep's clothing, right? We can be aware of them doctrinally.
I think the problem, and this is something that I've always thought about, because when I say that I was in the church a long time, I was in the church a long time. I didn't take it seriously till like teens, getting older and actually, finding a relationship with Jesus and actually accepting him as my Lord and Savior. Mm-hmm. I think at the end of the day, the thing that always I struggled with was this argument which originates from a hedonistic perspective. Mm-hmm. What makes me feel? How good? If this thing is good,
well, your best life now kind of books and things that have been written or to make for us feel example,
better. You brought up Judas, which interesting is a beautiful analogy for something like Hillsong or megachurches. Beautiful analogy. They betrayed the message of Jesus for coin and gold. Mm-hmm. And they hide behind it and say, oh no, we're still talking about it, but we're going to have infidelity on the other side. So the interesting thing about all this is there has to be something more that the church offers besides emotional stimulus. Because if the church is just offering emotional stimulus, per your message and per what we've discussed before, they'll walk in through the front door and they'll leave out the back because it's not emotional anymore. And the problem with this is it's a hedonistic argument. Because if we are searching for fleeting moments of emotional stimulus, then everything is purposeless. There's no point, there's no purpose, there's no message, there's nothing of substance.
I think you guys are missing my question. Maybe I phrased it wrong. But I said, why are people going? What is the baseline reason? And I'm saying it's an emotional need. It's something they're trying to fill. They want to feel better. I'm not saying
you are.
But you're talking about this hedonistic need to feel. We're human beings. We're human beings.
But you can't make the argument of we're searching for feelings, but then we have to make an intellectual argument. There's a separation there.
No, that's what we do every day.
No, I'm saying
that's sales 101.
Yeah, but
sales 101 is get somebody to emotionally hooked into whatever you're trying to sell them, and then they will automatically make the logical argument for why they bought it.
I'm not saying
that's what these guys are doing.
I know, and I'm not saying that's the case. Not the case. I'm saying that everybody's doing that.
I'm not saying that's not happening.
So the church shouldn't be doing that if everyone's doing that.
You're missing my point, though. So go out and go out into the world and as disciples and bring everybody to Christ. Okay, pretty broad. And these 12 studied for 3 years to define exactly how they're going to do that. And most all of them were martyred because of that, right? So there's a lot of historical context to why people should look at that and go, wow, it was that important to them. There must be more to this. Logically, I need to go to church and find out what that is. But that's not why people go. What I'm saying is the majority of people are looking, because of the world we're in, they're looking for an emotional bridge. Yeah. But it should only be a bridge to your point about discipleship. I'm saying there's a reason people go, but there needs to be a different reason They stay.
Well, it never changes. So I guess that's my
That's
point.
a good point.
Is it never changes? Is my point? Because, and I'm not to suggest that I'm somehow different than other people, because we all have, per your point, we're all human. We all have emotional stimulus. We all drive in a lot of ways emotionally. I guess my biggest qualm with all of this is the church, as the message of what I learned when I was growing up, and I could be wrong with this, is not supposed to be of the world. It's not supposed to be the same. You're not supposed to look at a church and then look at a corporation and be like, man, they're the same. Hillsong is just like Sony. You're not supposed to see that. Just like you're not supposed to be the exact same person after leaving church. You're not supposed to be someone who operates in the same type of way. You're not supposed to be someone who's just like, oh, yeah, I'm saved by grace, so I'm going to go boink my mistress. That's not what you're supposed to do. And I'm using that because we're going to jump into the Hillsong thing, because we're going to talk about Brian Houston and Carl Lentz. That's not what you're supposed to do. The Bible is pretty clear on that. And it's not to suggest that we have to be perfect. It's not to suggest that we can't sin, because everyone sins and everyone has problems. It's to suggest that you're supposed to be changed. And not just emotionally, not just from a charismatic perspective, but from an intellectual perspective. You're supposed to investigate. So then when something like this happens, to your point, you don't leave your faith, because you would have left it anyway. Someone could walk up and be like, oh, it's a baloney. You can't defend your argument. You leave your faith.
See, I feel like you're assigning blame to components of the church, the congregation. That's what I feel like you're doing.
To both.
Well, there's obvious blame to be assigned to the leadership that's not developing the right message or disseminating it the right way to keep people in the church. But I feel like that this conversation assigns too much, not blame, blame's the wrong word. It's assigning people that are going to church with too many requirements to actually go. There needs to be no requirements to go. And this is both the problem and the challenge.
I disagree with that. I don't think so. I don't think that's what I'm saying.
Don't you want everyone to get in and experience? And you talk about change when you leave.
So
everyone, incrementally at the very least, should be able to walk out the door and say, okay, I'm going to do something different today.
Yes, I agree with that.
And maybe the next day they do nothing different. But maybe they did 10%, something this much better.
But I don't think...
Isn't that what we all want?
I could be misinterpreting this, but from what I've read in the Bible when I was younger, I don't think the message of the Bible is everyone becomes saved. The message of the Bible is to spread the gospel.
But you don't even
get up to the person.
You don't even get to read the message of the Bible unless you get there.
I understand, but it's still, there has to be some point where they stop doing what the rest of society is doing. And that's why we're having the issues we're having today, because Hillsong is not distinguishable in any measure from a corporation that abuses its power, or a political group that abuses its power, or a group of people that all think the same and don't deviate. That's a problem. And here's the thing, I'm not laying blame with just the congregation, even though a lot of them knew about this stuff and never said anything, which makes them co-conspirators, makes them just as guilty. I mean, I'm not saying that people have to have this long list of things that they need before entering the doors of a church. I'm saying when they enter the doors of the church, they should at least open their Bible at home and say, this is actually more than just the club I'm a part of. Because if you never do that with anything, like college or school or politics, then you're going to end up voting for despots. You're going to go through college and not have learned a single thing. And you're going to go to churches and come out and be like, oh yeah, no, I was aware of the pastor doing what he was doing. And I didn't say anything and I'm still a congregant. That's the problem. There has to be it's 50-50. There's got to be a push from the car. You can't just sit there and be ingesting like a flower.
You cannot give the recipient of the message 50% of the negative on this. You can't.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying they have 50% of the responsibility.
You can't do that either.
Of course you can.
No,
why not?
You can't. Because again, these people are taking a message, and from my point of view, taking out of it what they deem is necessary to take out of it.
And the message...
Is that the wrong thing or the right thing? We can talk about that. Well, that's certainly the case, that they need to do things different and all that. But there are people that are elevated to positions of leadership because of their acumen about whatever they're supposed to believe in and disseminate. That's where the responsibility lies. There is a point which some of that spills downward into the masses, if you will. But you cannot... If the responsibility is not the church itself, that is a defined organization with a mission and parameters, all, I assume, put together by a bunch of people looking to try to do the right things, the right people trying to do the right things. Okay. But it's the people at the top that are, in my opinion, 95% responsible for the whole thing. It's not the HR people that feel like they're under the thumb or obligated to, or diminutive because of the leadership. It is the leadership, period. You got to cut off the head in this case.
I understand, and I agree with that. But my point being is the head would have been cut off if the rest of the congregation had have realized what their responsibility is. It's just like the honorable thing to do. If you believe that all of leadership is wholly, entirely responsible for all the bad decisions, and the people who put those people into leadership are not somehow to blame for allowing bad behavior, of course they do.
No, they don't. That's what we're talking about with this.
Can I interject just a little bit?
Sure, yeah, of course.
So I think that you're both right.
Yeah, it's the same.
So diplomatic of you.
Well, listening to both of your points of view, I would agree with both of you, because I've seen, I've stated myself, I would say that everything rises and falls with leadership. Okay, so that could be decision making, but that is, how you lead your congregation and who you're pointing your congregation to. Are you pointing your congregation to yourself, or are you pointing them to Jesus? If you're pointing them to Jesus, then you're going to remind your congregation, and you'll say things like, I'm sure you appreciated my message today, and I hope it encouraged you, but I want you to be like the Bereans in the book of Acts, who studied to ensure that what was being taught was scriptural, biblical as a foundation. The Bible also says to study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman who can rightly divide the word of truth. And that's not just to the pastors as an exhortation. That is to Christians. And then you have even the Hebrew author speaking to Christians. We don't necessarily know the age of these Christians or how long they've been Christians, but nonetheless, he says in Hebrews 5, hinge verse to chapter 6, he says, you ought to be teachers by now. Now, he's not talking to pastors. He's talking to congregants. And so, I think you're both right here. There's a leadership flaw, and there's a personal responsibility that has to be addressed, because I have found all too often that, again, leadership needs to be pointing them to Jesus, pointing them to scriptures, tell them to go study themselves and become a Berean, as it were, and to study those things, because, hey, not everything that I say from the pulpit, I've made mistakes from the pulpit, said things from the pulpit that I go back now as I mature more in Christ, and I go, man, I shouldn't have, that's out of context. I shouldn't have said that. So there's a both and here, not one or the other, in my opinion. Yeah. Just to add a little bit more to the conversation.
And I think what I'm trying to say is that. I'm not saying no. I mean, and I guess the thing that I'm trying to avoid this idol worship ideology, and I'm not saying you have it. I'm saying that I'm saying, yeah, I know you don't. Thank God, I don't think any of us here have it. I think it's like a parasocial relationship in society.
Unfortunately, people worship too many bulls.
Calves, bulls, exactly. Wolves, they all rhyme. But I guess my biggest thing is, like, I totally agree with your thing, like the Brian Houston thing, right? So somebody's been a part of leadership for years and years and years, is aware of something and chooses not to say something. 100% guilty. Guilt should be laid blame there. There were other people, just like with the Me Too thing. There are people aware of those things, and it's the thing that pisses me off, because it elongates the problem. It draws it out. If people were just honest, they not only expected but respected the honor they should have in society to each other, and if they had some understanding of it is a give and a take, not just a give and not just a take. It is both.
Let me remind you and our audience that the wolf is a person that specifically, I've known him for 12 years. He looks at a thing he wants to understand, and then he seeks to understand it. That is not the norm.
That's a rarity.
But it's not the norm.
I know it's not.
So no, let me just finish my thought, because using Bereans is a great example. Because being a Berean, studying what somebody is telling them is kind of a form of works in a way, right? But there's something that comes before that.
It's not salvific.
It's not, it's like an activity of development. It's not like I did this and then I get to go to heaven.
It should be a byproduct.
I'm not. Yeah. No. Let me. You jumped too far ahead of me. I'm not. I'm not suggesting that works is going to get you.
Said works to
open the gates. But works is an affect.
Yes.
Of belief, because belief without works is dead.
It's also an affective result, right?
So in desire to learn, it's what we're talking about with the wolf. But what comes before study in works?
Indoctrination.
Belief.
Brainwashing.
Belief does. And what is required of belief?
Witness of some degree.
A leap of faith.
Sure.
And what gets people to do that? You can't get somebody to. My whole point is, I think there's a kind of a.
I'm not disagreeing with your point. I think it's like and or.
This is what's fun about this.
Well, I think to Stingray's point, it's an and or, right? It's both. It's not like it's not either or. It's and.
Correct. But what I'm stating though is that I think what happens with these, especially these large entities, is they get overwhelmed with the idea of look at what's happening to us. Look at this. Going back to business, I've been involved in businesses for 30 years, and people get enamored with top line. Mm-hmm. They get enamored with the revenue. Look at the revenue we're bringing in. Mm-hmm. Oh my God! And then until they dig beneath that and see what their cost analysis is, and are they really even making margin?
Yeah.
What's their operating ratio? What's all these different things? You have to dig below the surface of numbers to decide what actually is happening. And the goal of a church is not to make money. When it becomes that, it ain't a church.
Yeah.
So but the goal, the ratios, all those business things we talk about are, how many people are we saving? How many people are we moving toward a better life? How many people are actually bringing that message to people outside of our church because of what we've helped them understand about their relationship with Jesus?
And I think that's indicative, to your point, of the leadership making moves to do things like that, to go out into the community. This goes
back to the first one we had with Stingray.
Exactly.
He's right on the money. You got this giant funnel letting people in. I don't think that's wrong.
No.
I really don't. I think what's wrong is after they're in here.
Well, and that's the problem, is I don't think that there is a significant portion of people that, one, are real evangelists, and two, have the capacity to do both of those things. It's either one or the other. That shouldn't be the case. There needs to be something taught within a community of either politics or church or culture, of being able to teach and welcome. Because you got a bunch of empty heads welcoming a bunch of people in and not providing anything. You're just creating a large group of people that go, yeah. That doesn't solve anything.
I didn't say it solved.
Well, I'm not saying you are. I'm saying the biggest thing that pisses me off about this, because, look, you say it like we're bringing up the Bereans, right? I don't think that everyone is either smart or stupid. I think that people are either told via their community or culture how they should be, and they follow that. If we have a culture of Christians that says we should be believers, we should welcome people in, we should love people and accept them where they are, but also have people who understand what the hell they're talking about, the problem's solved. Because here's the thing. You have just a guy on a pulpit saying something and a large group of people just listening. All you have is, to your point, a cult. When you have people that know what the message says, when you have people that know what a church should be, not what they want it to be, what it should be, informed community, intelligent individuals. Not intellect isn't just inherent. You got to cultivate it. And by intellect, I mean Christian and knowing what the Bible says and stuff like, like no stats and probability and shit like that. But you gotta take a test. And it doesn't even have to be that. It just have to be like, look, at least have some depth further than, well, Brian Houston and Frank Houston covered something up. So now because they covered it up because they were human and they were actually my God, not God, I'm no longer a Christian. That's what it is. That's what the byproduct of that problem is. And that's how you prevent it. Now, granted, I'm watering it down, and I'm not disagreeing with you because I think you're correct.
So which person, they only interviewed the ones who were really upset with the church and that had left and never going to go back again and that kind of thing. But you have, how many parishioners are still there? hundreds of thousands, right?
Well, there was 150.
less.
It was 150 in 30 countries, et cetera.
Significantly less.
I mean, if we look that up, I would imagine
it's like third.
It's a third. Let's say it's a third of that.
Yeah.
So a third of those people, I don't assign them with any level of less intelligence than the others.
No.
I assign them with a different level of viewing what we're talking about and finding something redeeming in the nature of this situation.
Yeah.
So, and who knows whether Hillsong rebranded will come back as a better thing. But this goes, and I thought a lot about this before we talked today. Our conversation from a few months ago, or whenever it was, in how you've taken the tact over your tenure with different churches to get to a certain point. And I'm sure you've tried to help course correct along the way. And if people don't want to course correct, you probably said, "Hey, this is not for me. I'm gone." Right. And a lot of people will do that. A lot of the people at this church will do that. But I think I don't mind charismatic people at the top. I think it's great to have somebody that you really want to listen to, that you're like, damn, that guy's got it going on. That gal's got it going on.
Nothing wrong with that. Yeah.
No, but then there needs to be a step back. Like it's almost, I can't remember the way you defined it before, but there's a process. Once you're into the big congregation here, then as you get more and more attuned to the message that makes sense, not for you, but for us based on biblical principles, then there's somebody that comes to you and says, would you like to really learn now? Truly learn. This is a great start. Love you where you're at. You can come every week just the way you are. But would you like to take the next step? And that's what seems to be missing in all of these things.
All of us went to Bible school, right? I did when I was a kid.
Sunday school, yeah.
I went to school at Calvary Chapel for fifth grade. So, I mean, and obviously Calvary Chapel's not the end all be all on, what the Bible says and how churches should be run and stuff like that. There's plenty of stuff wrong with Calvary Chapel. With that being said, like, that's no longer a thing from what we've had in other topics or other podcasts that we discussed.
Yeah.
So it goes back to kind of the whole thing we're talking about now is it's almost as if in a lot of facets of American society, this could be going on overseas, I don't know, but it seems like a lot of facets of society have just chosen to become incredibly lazy. And I don't mean that like intellectually only or faithfully only. I just mean that generally. Like we all know inherently, in a lot of ways, what the right or wrong thing to be doing is, just based on the years of civilization that we have ancestors and people have lived on. People kind of have an idea, maybe you shouldn't kill people type thing. Maybe we shouldn't steal. Like and I'm not saying that might be subject to change or not. I'm saying that we all know deep down inside, specifically from our past with churches, what should be the case. It's pretty easy to understand from my perspective. You should go to a church and not be taken advantage of. You, to your point, go there, feel better, come away from it, my point, knowing and learning something different, and then maybe taking some time out of your week to spend some time reading. I don't necessarily know if that's even said anymore, because I haven't stepped into a church in a long time, specifically because of this stuff. And that's on me, and it's not like I'm not talking about the theology. I'm talking about what would be the bride of Christ, right? If the bride is if there's something wrong with the bride, we need to figure out what that problem is. And we don't have an answer because we're not, experts in this area. But I still think that like there are pretty simple things that we could all do that would change things for the better.
To one of your points, I think that you're correct in the fact that there has been a laziness, and I think there has been also kind of a dumbing down of the individual who's in the pulpit. I think I mentioned this last time, but you look at the earlier stages of church as a whole, that there was always scholars and theologians in pulpits, right? They were theologically trained in one way, shape, or another, and so there was a matter of trust there with them, because they were took 5 to even maybe sometimes 10 years of their life just to study the Word of God. I mean, these guys who they were the type that could read and write Greek and Hebrew, right? I mean, they were just very smart individuals. But then it came to that point where it was just about anybody with personality and charisma can be down in the pulpit.
Common sense
stuff that we mentioned last time. And so people gravitated towards that charisma, not so much the intellect any longer. And so just as long as you can hold the attention span of somebody for 30, 40 minutes nowadays, that's what people go after. So it's kind of this dumbing down in a way. And that's not good. And then if there's a lessening of, well, just if you lessen the importance of education, biblical education in the pulpit, then that pastor in the pulpit's never going to encourage the congregation to go be a Berean. In fact, I've heard pastors say this so many times, and every time I hear it, my blood just, I mean, it's just, I get so upset with this, but they'll say, we're not here for information, but for transformation. Now think about the depths of that comment. It's not about information, it's about transformation. Well, is it? Sure. I think it is a lot about the information, because it's the information that transforms me. And it's got to be good theological information that you're going to give me from the pulpit. But they're like, we want less information and more transformation. What does that mean?
Nothing.
You're just saying to me that we just want you to listen to every single word that I say, and that's it. And the buck stops here. So you have masses of people in these congregations that just keep going because it's just all about that transformation. The only transformation you're going to have is from what that guy's saying up there. Because he's not telling you to go dig a little deeper, go get more information, get a commentary, for heaven's sake, get a Bible dictionary. You know, one of the key indicators that I look for now in churches, when I left the most recent church, I was on staff there for 3 years, I started obviously looking at their statement of faith and how well it was written, how theologically sound it was written. How long, do they just do these little blurbs and then attach a few verses to it? Or is there somebody behind there, somebody on staff that's actually really putting together a pretty in-depth statement of faith? The second thing I look for is, are they teaching classes? And if you find a church that's teaching classes like apologetics, okay, that's kind of cool. If you find a church that's teaching hermeneutics, okay, that's kind of cool, because a lot of pastors don't want you taking a class on hermeneutics, by the way.
Why is that?
Because now you take a class on hermeneutics, you know how to go and get all the resources and all the tools that actual pastor spent money. Some of them, not most of them, don't go to Bible college anymore, but they all of the tools and resources like Logos Bible software and things that pastors should be using.
Can we differentiate for the viewers and listeners the difference between apologetics and hermeneutics so they understand?
Yeah, so apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which just means to give a defense for the faith, right? You're defending your faith. It's that, being a workman that I mentioned earlier in the verse. And then hermeneutics is basically the art and science of biblical interpretation. So you're learning the art and science of how to interpret the Bible. So when you think of like an art form or a science as a whole, you think of a scientist. How long does a scientist go to school for?
Years.
They're always in school. They're constantly learning and growing, right? Or an art form, like a ballerina who goes through her entire life. She's 3-4 years old, starts off, and she's just growing and growing and growing in her craft and her art form to the point where she's in New York City, right? And tens of thousands of people, or not tens of thousands, but you get my idea, coming to see her because it's an art form, and it's taken her entire life to get to that point. So we look at hermeneutics. We look at time, effort, and discipline. So you're teaching your congregation to put in time, to put in effort, and discipline every single day to read and enjoy the Bible from the outlook of, how do I interpret what this is saying? Because it's an ancient book.
Yeah.
So you find churches that are teaching those types of classes, and for me, that is that's a green light in a lot of ways. Now, of course, you got to go, and I always meet with the pastor. Like, I just met with the pastor for 2 hours down the street from here. Really nice guy, young, doesn't have very much ministry experience, but had a wonderful conversation with him theologically. Will we end up going there? I'm not quite sure. I'm still kind of looking. But anyway, I'm just saying those are some good indications. To answer your question, sorry, I went on a tangent.
Yeah.
But specifically, they don't want you to take a class on hermeneutics, because now you're sitting in the service every single Sunday, and in a lot of ways, you're kind of like fact checking the pastor. Now, when I teach hermeneutics, I tell the people in my class, I say, look, don't be the context police every single time you go to church now. It's going to be challenging and difficult for you not to be the context police. Try to still enjoy the entire experience and what the pastor's teaching and saying, but at the end of the day, it's good and healthy for you to go, wait, I studied that a month ago or a week ago, and go, that's not right. What he's saying there. It's okay to do that, but don't get hung up on that. Like, I always tell people in my hermeneutics class, don't bring a commentary to church with you. Because you're going to be so distracted, constantly fact-checking the pastor with your commentary, everything that they say. Try to enjoy it. Go back, be the Berean, and study for yourself later.
Yeah. Well, I think
pastors don't want that to happen. A lot of them don't.
Well, I think the same can be said for the educational system. And I've had this conversation with your brother, and we've had him on the show, Professor Mark Joslin. And there seems to be this general pushback from people who are in those leadership positions across the board, not just in the church, of not wanting people to know as much as them for fear of losing that power. And I always go back to the analogy of, the pastor is supposed to be the shepherd of the flock. Doesn't mean that the flock can't know what he's saying. Because here's the thing, you don't have to agree with everything he says. He's interpreting from his perspective. It doesn't mean that what he's saying is wrong inherently. It doesn't mean that what you believe is right inherently. It just means that his word or his tenor of what he's saying might be a little bit different. And if you can go back home and say, well, he did say this one thing out of the book, he quoted that one thing, but I don't necessarily agree with that interpretation, that means that you can at least defend your faith in the event that it happens to become attacked by instances like Hillsong.
I think a lot of it is the old mentor-apprentice kind of thinking that would be more necessary to the advantage of a church growing in the correct directions and using professorships or leaderships and people that have studied the Bible over years and years is a good thing. Knowing apologist, Barry Minkow was an incredible apologist and probably believed a lot of what he was saying. I watched him. Who's the famous atheist that's always, he runs a magazine and everything. I can't remember his name. He's still on.
Oh, didn't he debate Jordan Peterson recently?
Yeah, he did. That's and he's very, very famous. I watched Barry debate him one time, and he was just tearing him apart. And that's great. And talk fast, charismatic, and really knew his stuff, which is fantastic, but also can be dangerous. Questioning the professor, I think, is a huge, legitimate part of learning. Questioning your leadership, questioning might be the wrong. Trying to understand better, but also acknowledging that those people should know more is the key to what you're talking about. If you just have somebody up there that knows how to talk real well and goes in circles and anecdotes and things like this, and really, again, there has to be a layer. There has to be a developmental layer. So being the Berean and sitting back and going, yeah, I've learned that, and I've had my hermeneutics, as you said, hermeneutics, and I understand more than the average bear, and I'm wondering what he really says. It doesn't mean you should go off and start your own church now. But it means you should understand more about the context of defending your faith and doing what you need to do.
Well, and I think that to people, because to your point, you're not wrong about the congregation not needing to be the same amount of responsibility. I think the point that I'm trying to make is when you have a situation where there are people within the congregation or within a school or within politics that are versed enough, may not be the focal point, might not be the mic, but they are versed enough to be able to understand what's happening. When something falls apart so tragically like Hillsong, and tragically for the congregation, terribly and evilly for the leadership, because what they did was evil and terrible. It just was. There's no other way to put it. It doesn't mean those people are evil. It just means what happened, the cover-up, all that stuff, which we'll jump into in a second. I think the issue here is it's when you have people within the community that can coalesce around each other as a community and say, look, what happened is not representative of what the Bible says. We all know that. What happened should not be representative of what your faith is. We all know that, because each of us should have an individual faith with Jesus and with what we believe to be our Father and our Savior. When you have that stuff, the church might fall apart in a lot of ways, but not so catastrophically. You might have some, but you're not going to have a ton of people that are going to be like, yeah, well, I'm an atheist now. I'm a happy atheist, per one of those guys said. You should be able as a church
to differentiate the failings of the human beings administering that entity from that entity.
Yeah,
that's the difference.
Well, and I think that's what's so alarming about these mega churches. And we can jump into this scandal with Brian Houston really quick. What's so alarming, and we'll do it right after this. What's so alarming to me about this is the church, and through the 4-part docuseries when I was watching this with Beowulf, I was just saying, this isn't a church. It's not a church. It's not. It's a club. It's a bunch of people going to a community club, an adult club, friend group. Because what they're talking about, what Carl Lentz, the charismatic individual who we'll talk about shortly as well, what he was saying on stage was, even one of the analogies he used of the pastor hitting the sheep with a stick to break its leg. That's not true. That's false. Pastors didn't do that. They would actually tie a weight to why would you break the leg of your sheep? Think about, why would you break the leg of your sheep? My child, he disobeyed me and didn't put his toys away, so I broke his arm. What? That's not how you teach people, and that's not how you teach a sheep. So you listen to these individuals that are parroting these things that are easily debunkable if you just use a few minutes of your time to just look to what it actually says. It says it in the Bible, it says it online. Now, granted, not everything online should be believed, and not everything in the Bible should be taken literally. With that being said, it's like the thing that gets me is these megachurches, they harbor these people because they're not really, in my opinion, churches. They're not really churches. And now the big issue with Brian Houston, he has been specifically associated with the sexually, not him personally and individually, but his father has been associated with the sexual abuse of young boys from, I believe, 1960s and 70s onward in his leadership. Brian Houston was the son of Frank Houston, and Brian became aware of these allegations allegedly in 1999. So, long time ago. And he, at that time, quote unquote, removed his father from leadership in the Assemblies of God churches in Australia, even though that really, unfortunately, didn't happen fully, which is a denomination of Hillsong at that time. Now, Brian, to the point that we talked about a little bit ago, a lot of these churches tend to have their own internal investigations. Brian did one with a grouping of people within his church who would submit to his end-all decision-making, which kind of kept the controversy going because nothing really seemed to change, unfortunately. And in 2001, an Australian Royal Commission into the institutional response of child sexual abuse was established, and as part of that commission, Brian Houston testified about his knowledge of his father's abuse and the actions taken by Hillsong Church. The commission concluded that Brian had a conflict of interest when dealing with the allegations due to his familial relationship with the abuser, and it's important to note that since that scandal, Hillsong had conducted and implemented various changes within their church and policies to address those issues. Those measures eventually became known as the establishment of a safe church office, which I thought was interesting that they did. But more recently, Brian Houston was actually charged with driving under the influence of alcohol in Orange County, California on February 26, 2022. He recorded a blood alcohol reading of 0.08 and admitted his decision to drive under the influence was foolish. He resigned as pastor of Hillsong in 2021 amidst allegations of financial misconduct and accusations of concealing his late father's child sexual abuse, to which he pleaded not guilty. And the church claimed that they were not aware of Houston's charges until after his resignation, and they consider it a personal matter. The case is still ongoing, and I believe, I could be wrong, but I believe the verdict is actually supposed to be given by a judge in August of 2023. So August 16th, I believe, is the end date of that. So we'll see what those allegations, whether they become convictions or not. But yeah, so that's kind of the whole thing around Brian Houston specifically. I think the big problem with Hillsong is with those decisions, those financial abuses, which eventually came out, and the sexual abuses, which eventually came out. There also seemed to be this, to your point you made a little bit ago, of this message of prosperity gospel, which seems to be a common thing. So there's a lot going on here, a ton going on within this docuseries, and a ton going on with the church, and
all of it kind of revolves around. Again, I don't know where this all happened. If we segregate the child abuse issues from Father Frank, there, I know you can't entirely do so, but if you look at somewhere along the line, developing a place for people to gain faith and grow and plant seeds of other churches and do all this kind of stuff, there's a tipping point somewhere. Don't know where it is. It all has to do with money, for sure. Otherwise, and I think it was the Assembly of God's thing. It was like several head people in the Assembly of God churches in Australia, in New Zealand, maybe. Were part of the council from the docuseries that kind of decided. And so they knew that there were other pastors out there that knew what was going on with Frank. Mm-hmm. And they kept it all quiet, kind of like the dioceses have done over the years with the Catholic Church. for the betterment of whatever, we can't disclose this.
Betterment of mankind.
It's kind of what the long-haired dude said in the Zoom call, right? Mm-hmm. We're not gonna not expose this, but we're not gonna expose it, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And it that's the human downfall of these things. You said it would be much better earlier. You said it would be much better to do the hard thing early on and overcome it. And you're absolutely right on. Absolutely right on. But for whatever reason, when these people are inside of these organizations, they can't come to that decision. They don't come to that decision. Mm-hmm. They always come to the decision that there's some higher purpose that says we must sweep this under the rug for the betterment of our congregation, our community, what we've established worldwide. We don't want it to be degraded.
I know exactly what
it's crazy.
I know who it is. It's like the most beautiful angel of all time, and he fell from heaven. Mm-hmm. Lucifer, higher purpose. That's exactly what he'd say. Yeah, just sweep it under the water. Just sweep it under there. You don't need to talk about it. You don't need to talk about that thing. That's exactly what he would do. And
I wasn't really trying to take over.
Kids.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate, and I think
I can tell that Stingray's got something pent up here.
Well, what I think we should do, since
we've got him on tilt.
Well, how I've heard it said is when these things happen within the church, it's a distraction. The devil is trying to distract us from being on mission. And so they kind of, at times, they'll actually blame the devil. And that's kind of how they spin it at first to the congregation, that the devil's attacking. So we must be doing something right. Right? That's how they spin it.
So all this horrible stuff we're doing must be doing something
the
right.
The FBI is investigating us.
Remember, they don't come out in the very beginning stages and saying we're doing something right or something bad happened. It's the spin zone. They're spinning it in the beginning stages. They're trying to sweep it under the rug and handle things quietly. And so I couldn't help to think about, something that happened while I was at the church in San Diego, where there was an academy, a Christian academy music teacher that was molesting kids. My daughter was in his class. Fortunately, she was not one of his victims. But it was years later that a lot of children came forward as they got a little bit older, because they were in the third grade when this happened. There was 8 of them. But what I learned later on, going back to like the HR point, is one of my friends from that church who was, this big giant man. He was 6'4". He was an former gang member from Long Beach. He was an OG, right? He was an original gangster. This guy was not to be messed with, but he was a Christian. He was a pastor now, right? But he was still, one of those types. Well, he saw this individual fondling a little girl as the elevator doors opened, reported it immediately to HR. And when he reported to HR, he got fired. You can you can Google all of this. There's articles. I sent them to you last night. Yep. They fired him because he was a whistleblower, and they fired his wife. Right? And so because it went to HR went to leadership. Leadership just wanted to sweep it under the rug, and they ended up having no disciplinary action with that teacher for at least 2 years. Then all the children came out years later, and then they fired the academy teacher. And that's when I learned about it. That's when I learned about that, because my friend couldn't say anything to me because he was under there was legal stuff happening in the background, so he couldn't tell anybody what was happening after he got fired. And so one of my good friends, his daughter was one that was a victim of this pedophile. And most of the things that happened and transpired over that, once they fired the teacher, of course, as staff, they're just letting us know that they let Mr. Schaefer go. That's all we know. And so because of the relationships that megachurches have within, police and political figures and the news stations, right? All those relationships that they have, nothing gets leaked. Everything's being handled behind closed doors the entire time. Well, then it was, I had learned of some of the things that took place, obviously, because my friend, who was absolutely beside himself because it affected his daughter, he came to me and we had a number of conversations. And you think, going back to when I should have resigned from that church, that's when I should have resigned. If I go back to a moment in time where I should have resigned, it should have been then. It should have been in that moment, but I still stayed. Many factors on the reasons why, but nonetheless, I should have left then. But then I learned later that because everything was swept under the rug, that this music teacher ended up just going down the street and being a music teacher at another church. All the legalities was handled behind closed doors. So, those are some of the things that happens within these churches.
He didn't go to Barry's church, did he? Is that where he went?
I don't think so. I think Barry was
after.
He had the same Barry's fall in ministry was before that, I think.
Because this was like in 2000.
You're right.
We're talking 2000, probably 12 when this happened. 13 somewhere in there.
Would have been way before that.
Yeah.
I really struggle. I struggle so hard with the rationalizing of something like that. Not to suggest that everybody's.
But you can see why people condemn the organizations.
Well, that's what I'm
saying.
Stuff like it's like you look at that scenario, and as a leader in the church, or as like the head of the church, that's something like that happens. Cut the head of the snake off.
Totally.
And all you have to say is, "Yeah, we don't stand by that."
Totally agree.
Well, he's going to go to the authorities. We don't stand by that.
Totally agree.
We'll press charges.
Totally agree.
That's how you solve the problem. I mean, and this is kind of like, because here's the thing: is like, you lose some people, and there will be media attention. There'll be a media circus. You'll have a bunch of people that have that scenario, and they'll all come back and they'll say, "Why? Why did this happen?" And obviously, there might not be answers for that.
Well, one of the just to share another quick story, one of the worship pastors at a church that I worked for, he commits suicide. And so all that we're told is that we need to have a service right away about mental illness. That was the spin, is that he committed suicide because of mental. Now, keep in mind, when you do just historically looking at that, there's been a lot of pastors in the last 10 years, 15 years that have committed suicide, or church leadership. And so knowing that, they just kind of spun it as mental illness. And so, but then I learned that the reason why this individual committed suicide is because he had been molesting his stepdaughter for years. She said something to one of the other pastors. Now she's 16 years old. This has been happening since she was a little girl. And this is a pastor leading a church congregation in worship. And so I've learned about all of this through various, contacts and colleagues of mine. But the church at large and the staff at large is just getting the message that we, poor so-and-so who committed suicide, we really need to start focusing on mental illness and the health of our staff. So then, because this was a leader, this was a pastoral leader in the community for many, 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 many years. And so they did the memorial service there at the church. And of course, we were all, it's strongly suggested, obviously, that you attend all the memorial services of a colleague of yours, a pastor of yours on staff, that you attend. Well, once I learned what was happening, I said, no way, I'm not going to attend. Because everyone's going to go up there and say nice things about this person. And that's exactly what happened. Every single person that went up there and said anything about this individual was very nice, kind, spiritual leaders type stuff about this person. But at the end of the day, he was a monster. An absolute monster. But that's how they handled that situation. Again, it's to save whatever they have, right, in the midst of that, meaning the church congregation. They don't want to lose any members at all in that. Because if people learned that that's what was actually going on. And of course, it was spun later on that as we kind of learned more about the issues, months and 2 months later, that it was their family that had kind of asked that not be exposed and whatnot. But at the end of the day, even that's wrong. I mean, you don't go up there and you don't memorialize someone's life like that when really what really happened was something terrible.
Well, they're not wrong that it's mental illness. Well, they're not wrong about that.
They're not wrong about that. But that's part of the spin
as a spin move.
Yeah.
Well, it conflates multiple things. I mean, this is why I get so frustrated with all this stuff, because it makes something that isn't inherently just that to people. Mm-hmm. It's like dude, not everyone that commits an atrocity is someone who's suffering from mental illness. Mm-hmm. And look, again, this goes back to like the church's message. We're all flawed. We all have our problems and stuff like that. But it makes that message incredibly pointless when you don't stand against things.
That's right.
And that's why
having integrity.
Exactly. Because here's the thing is forgiveness and naivety are two separate things. Mm-hmm. Forgiveness and cover up are two separate things. Mm-hmm. And apologizing without change is not apologizing. Mm-hmm. And obviously killing yourself, God rest that person's soul wherever it ended. Mm-hmm. With that being said, like there's a distinct like disconnect that I see. And it's not just within the church. It's like, guys, things have a root cause. And when you end up covering up whatever that root cause is, not only are you ignoring what the victim went through, you're ignoring what other victims have gone through, you're ignoring what people have struggled with for years. And then what ends up happening is the backlash is so extreme that there can't be a conversation about it that's reasonable ever about anything. And that doesn't just come to about molestation. That goes to every single problem within society, because we keep swinging back and forth. You got one group that's protecting their group because it makes them feel better. And you got another group that is unwilling to acknowledge that maybe if we all change, things would change.
A thought came to mind when I was listening to the last episode last night was there's a Hillsong private Facebook group or a page or something that people have joined. And I thought that actually could be something healthy for those who have been, victimized by the church in one way, shape, or another. But it caused me to think of, well, how many reports of abuse has happened, not just with Hillsong, but with many churches, right? Where they first will go to the congregation to report the abuse. Now, I'm not talking just molestation and things. It could be verbal. It could be whatever type of abuse.
Just bad behavior.
Just bad in general, not loving, not kind, or whatever type of abuse it is. And they go to the church and they go to leadership and they say, hey, this just happened. And it's just, again, swept under the rug. I bet you that happens so often. Now, thankfully, some people, if it is sexual abuse in any shape or form, they do end up going to the authorities, and that's how things start to unravel a little bit more. But I started thinking about that idea of these, because if there's no accountability happening from within the church leadership, meaning they've hand-selected these individuals, these men and women, to be the yes men and women of the congregation to whatever the senior pastor wants, then if there were these private Facebook groups for the congregants to just basically voice what has happened to them, that can in turn be a healthy thing, because it'll keep the church in a lot of regards accountable. Because if there's no accountability to happen there, it has to be created somewhere, somehow.
Well, right? I guess that kind of leads into my question that I wanted to kind of address with this is we talk about, like, in America, churches are not taxed. They don't, and the oversight from the federal government, if it were to be imposed, you'd have to wonder, well, what level of oversight would that be?
Right.
But the question that I have is there could be a happy medium, because corporations are subject to certain things. They're subject to outside bodies. They're subject to individuals that look at something from a legal perspective and say, well, this isn't going well, so the leadership needs to be prosecuted or it needs to be disbanded. Is that not a logical thing that could potentially occur, not maybe on behalf of the federal government, but on behalf of a third-party private institution? I mean, I feel like that's a watchdog group of some sort.
What you're talking about is a regulatory body of some kind, right?
There's none.
And within the church systems, there are, and usually it's the senior pastors of all these different organizations that have outside consortiums that talk about things from a holistic standpoint in the country or outside the country, planning churches, all those kinds of things. The challenge is always where does that stop? There's something called regulatory capture that's huge in almost any industry you can talk about. And it's a circular situation where, the regulators are overseeing a particular industry yet the lobbying efforts from that industry are basically paying for the governmental agencies that supply the regulators. And so by the end of the day, you don't know whether the tail is wagging or the dog is running. Yeah, you have no idea what's going on. And those kinds of things can make it even more complex. I think, interestingly enough, the argument in the fourth part of that series that you just brought up with the Facebook groups, as much as we talk about social media and all the horrible things that can present, it does create, by individuals, that things have happened to it, creates the ability for them to communicate and group and discover they're not alone. Because most abuse does not get translated to the authorities or any kind of leadership group, primarily because people think they're alone. They're the only ones it's happening to. And when they discover they're not, that gives them the power to go outside of themselves and start talking about it. Now, we're just such complex animals, it's unbelievable sometimes. And there's no right or wrong answer to a lot of the stuff we're talking about, except for what I'll go back to is it's always better to shine a light on something than to hide it.
Yeah.
Always.
I think one of the bbest points that were made here today about that.
And obviously, people watching and listening, take away from this what you want. Because at the end of the day, I don't want this to be a whole, just wholly a criticism of Christianity or wholly a criticism of just the church or for or against anything. I think that this argument is equally applicable to all areas and facets of society. We can't continue to have systems that are so incestuous with one another that things such as violence or sexual abuse or abuse generally exist within those systems by merit of them being so large, because or so small. They shouldn't exist. We shouldn't exist in a society like that. So I think, at the end of the day, this Hillsong, I guess, overall narrative for the American church is, my suggestion, it's going to sound really silly because people have said this for years now, is it needs to be changed and rebuilt. I mean, I don't think the Hillsong structure operates effectively, and I don't think that it builds much of anything outside of a media and money empire.
So, from both of your standpoint, visualizing Carl on stage as
Carl Lentz,
as the charismatic pastor wearing his damn leather jacket, into skinny what Carl was and what Carl was at the end. Where do you see him? I mean, I immediately got the impression that he's trying to reinvigorate the next 10 years of his future. Well, and not necessarily, I mean, one sense they did a very good job of saying he's changed, he's gone through therapy, he's done all this other stuff, his family's around him, but the visuals, the way they filmed him, the way he looked,
was
kind of prescribed to me that he just decided he's a different person now. He's got a different persona that he's developing. For the next chapter.
This is what my knee-jerk reaction to something like that is I don't know him as a person. Don't know him. I can't attest to his character because I don't know him. What I can say, based on what was presented to me, what I saw over the years prior to Hillsong imploding on itself, using the word imploding, I shouldn't. But prior to all that, what I always got from Carl Lentz was very much the same vibe of what I get from people like Joel Osteen or megachurch pastors who are more about the charisma and the message of their $5,500 Saint Laurent jacket than they are about the actual substance of what comes out of their mouth. And it's terrible what he went through. I feel sympathy for what he went through, but I also know that he put himself there and willingly was aware of what was going on behind the scenes. And also the question I have is, it takes a very particular person to bring in a third party into your home and then proceed while your children are being managed by that third party to have an affair with that person. I don't know what type of redemption can come back from that. I don't know what his message is, but I don't trust much of what came out of his mouth.
I'm talking specific to his.
No, I know he's going to do a comeback tour. 100%.
There's absolutely,
yeah.
And he's becoming a different character. That's what, and I'm assigning a lot of things to him that I don't have a legitimate right to assign. This is just a show, but I think that's my point. It was a show for him. Mm-hmm. It was certainly a show for his boss, who anybody that saw that mustache in the 80s should have known right away it was a problem. I'm sorry. but Carl's going to have a comeback like you wouldn't believe. You just watch.
Well, and the thing that I guess concerns me about that is with someone like that, you never really know where their genuineness
don't know. Hope he is.
Well, you don't know where their genuineness begins, and you don't know where their genuineness ends and their lies begin. I think that's a big problem. And there's a lot of people like that, and I don't know how you fix it.
I don't know how you fix it either, but regardless, if he does reinvent himself, he'll have people following him.
Oh,
for
yes,
sure, regardless
absolutely.
of the intentions and whatever his mode is. But yeah, I don't know. I'm a skeptic now more than ever.
I think you have to be.
So,
right?
Well, I don't know how you can, because here's the thing, and I was talking to Beowulf about this again while watching this docuseries, and I'm like, do I feel bad for him? Yes, to some degree, but more like I would feel bad for someone who put themselves in such a crazy position that they now have to deal with the trauma and damage that they've done to the people around them. Mm-hmm. Person I felt bad about the most within that entire thing was his wife.
Yeah,
that's what I felt about. His wife and then his kids. and if I was him, I wouldn't have a comeback tour. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't. That's how I would make my how I would admit that I'm actually sorry.
He's sitting there selling. Wasn't insurance. It was something.
Advertising.
Advertising.
Yeah,
which I thought was very interesting.
It was very interesting, and I honestly I don't wish him any ill. I don't wish him ill, but I do think that if I were to look at the quantifiable events that led up to what happened with him, and then the stuff that he also was aware of, that he admitted he was aware of, I would have just been like, okay, done with the church, done with leadership. That's what I would say. Mm. And maybe he has. Maybe that's what it is. Because he's a very, very charismatic individual, and there's a difference between someone who is charismatic with restraint and someone who is charismatic without restraint. And unfortunately, at that time in his life, I don't think there was a lot of restraint. But yeah, I would encourage the viewers and listeners to please, after listening to this very difficult to talk about conversation, difficult to talk about topic, I would encourage the viewers and listeners to do some research investigation for yourself. And if you happen to be someone who happens to be tied to some sort of theology, whether Christianity or Islam or any theology whatsoever, I would always recommend to understand the theology and do not base your belief in the theology on the people who are speaking about it to you. That's what I would say. Now, that's just my opinion.
Seek to understand, not to be understood.
Yeah. So, that wraps up this very special Patreon episode. If you happened to like our content, you can find it on Instagram at The Wolf and Bull. And you can also find us all on all major listening platforms. But yeah, Stingray, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully next
Thanks
time.
for having me.
Hopefully next time we talk, it's not about the most depressing possible thing possible. But yeah, I think we've talked about common sense realism. We should dive into that eventually. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's it, guys. Thanks so much. We'll catch you soon.